Something unprecedented has happened over the last few weeks. An indie horror film called Skinamarink that was made for $15,000 was leaked from a small film festival, got viral hype on TikTok, Twitter, what have you. People were saying it's the scariest and most experimental film ever made, a new horror masterpiece, and it has now made $890,000. That's almost 60 times its budget after being in theaters for 4 days. It'll also be streaming on Shudder on February 2nd, and I'm sure it'll have a killer debut. But it's unheard of for something like this to even be playing in AMC theaters, never mind making this much money. But going viral like this is proving to be a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's obviously great for the film and great for the director, Kyle Edward Ball, and great for indie horror. I cannot believe how big horror has been winning lately. Between this and Terrifier 2, we've had some awesome underdogs just in the last 6 months, but Skinamarink makes Terrifier 2 look like the most normal thing ever. So it's this really abstract and slowly paced film that's kind of gotten in front of people and marketed to people that it wasn't originally intended for. No one really knew what to expect from it, and now reviews are all over the map, which is totally fine. It's fine for people not to enjoy it. It is a film that will not be everyone's thing. But I saw the film and I enjoyed it. There are some things about it that I'm mixed on, which we'll talk about, but there are not a lot of negative reviews going out that I won't call bad faith reviews. We'll say they are willfully reductive, with a sort of contempt towards the film, sort of writing it off as something pretentious where nothing happens and it's just shots of walls. And as kind as I try to be about film being subjective, because it is, I think that painting this film in that way is just unfair. So I wanted to make this video just to talk about my experience and talk about it more in depth so that people who are curious about it can kind of gauge if they think it'd be their thing, because this film not only has structure but has a really interesting point beyond just being artsy or experimental. I'll get into what the film is like stylistically in a second, which is nothing you've ever seen before, but you're essentially following these two toddlers, Kevin and Kaylee, who wake up in the middle of the night and find that their dad is missing and all of the windows and doors in their house start to vanish. The house is pitch black and silent save for the flickering light of a TV playing old cartoons, the whispering of the kids, and eventually a new unknown voice as the house descends into an unfriendly and almost supernatural space, to say the least. I would encourage people to watch the trailer for this film because I feel like it does accurately represent the vibe that you're walking into with this movie. But the first thing that you notice about it is that it has this really aggressive digital grain throughout. It's, I guess, what you could call found footage, but it's sometimes static shots and sometimes the POV of these two kids. So it's very much invoking Paranormal Activity and the Blair Witch Project. You're gonna hear a lot of those comparisons. I think what it takes most from those films is especially the end of the Blair Witch Project when they're in that house, that it just feels like this liminal space, like the entire house is a portal to this other demonic dimension. And I loved that because I think what this film really does best is replicating that threatening darkness of an empty house and how your eyes can play tricks on you. It's constantly forcing you to stare into dark corners and sit next to them. And the longer you stare, the more that the grain swirls and comes alive in such a way that you swear you can make out shapes in the darkness, which is sometimes, I think always intentional, but sometimes there really is something there. It gave me a very fight or flight feeling, like the feeling you get when you turn out all the lights at night and sprint up the stairs. You just can't stand to feel the tension of looking at it anymore, but the film forces you to, and that was really effective and terrifying for me. It's also shot very unconventionally. The angles are almost always from the floor looking up or from behind an object, so as to always obscure the subject's face, which is usually the kids. They're kind of anonymous. You just know their names and hear them whisper, but you'll only see their legs or them sitting from behind or their feet dangling off the side of the bed, things like that. And all of that is creepy on its own, but it becomes so much more visceral when you realize that this presence in the house with them is a manifestation of abandonment and neglect and how a child might process that. And a lot of it is up for interpretation. The director has even commented on just how much of this film goes unexplained. But, parents physically leaving or even emotionally abandoning a child while they're still living together. I even think of suicide or mental illness creating that distance. It's frightening just to watch or hear about things like that, but we also all harbor those emotions from when we were children. And I think this film really evokes that part of your inner child, especially as the kids are finding comfort and safety in the glow of the TV TV. Like, it almost becomes their surrogate guardian, which is kind of dark. And it's corrupting all of these childhood toys, Legos, that little phone freak, turning them into something unfriendly. It's a very nihilistic film, and to me, greater than the sum of its parts. Like, I've been loving reading about it, and the more I think back, I see how what's happening to these kids evolved and how there is a linear plot. The director has drawn parallels to Hansel and Gretel too, which makes a ton of sense. But all that being said, yeah, it's really slow, and if you can't get sucked into that, it's gonna be a tough watch. Like, this is the kind of film that you kind of enter into an agreement with to get on that strange wavelength with it. And for me, I honestly think it took me a good 30 minutes to get there, because I hadn't watched the trailer. I'm not on TikTok right now. Like, I had zero idea what I was walking into. There is very limited dialogue and, yeah, a lot of long shots of random shit. And you're like, oh God, is this the whole thing? But eventually you start to piece it together. And though the pacing was the biggest issue for me at first, I found the whole experience to be very rewarding at the end. And I think as it goes along, it's useful to kind of put yourself in the mindset of the kids, because, yeah, there's no action, not like these big events happening, but it commits to being very surrealistic, and it's just meant to represent something. So there's less plot, more of this feeling that Kyle Edward Ball is trying to create. It does employ a couple jump scares though, I think like 2 or 3, that to me were effective, even though you can definitely see them coming. I thought the most terrifying bits were a scene in a bedroom and a scene with a phone call. The people who have seen it will immediately know what I'm talking about. The phone call especially is horrifying because it kind of connects this liminal space with the real world in a way that is like very uncanny. It's kind of the first time that the film kind of breaks the illusion and has like a real life conversation in it. In that moment, it feels so real that it transitions from being spooky to really just being really sad, which I wasn't expecting. I also thought just formally and technically, it's so interesting and well done. All of the voices, demonic and otherwise, are designed to perfection to be scary but not overdone. The kids' voices kind of echo and feel just as grainy as the footage. And again, the footage, or in what you can see in the darkness, is uncertain but suggests just enough to constantly freak you out. There's like selective subtitling, which I thought was interesting, and I'd be curious to watch it again and kind of think about why the director did what he did. But overall, this is really just something that you need to experience yourself, come to your own conclusions. Some people will think it's the scariest thing ever. I found it very haunting and not so much scary in the typical sense, but just something that really gets under your skin and like latches onto your brain. The scariest movie experience I ever had was seeing the Evil Dead remake in theaters when I was in 8th grade. And from that day forth, I knew it was one of the best horror remakes ever. Again, not everyone will vibe with this movie, and I'm not trying to say if you understood it, you'd like it, because that's just not true. I have a ton of friends and critics who I love who are like, that was not for me at all. But I did want to debunk a, like, literally every single shot is just a shot of a corner and nothing happens, because I think there's so much to this film that's really interesting, and I think we should have more really experimental and indie horror films like this in theaters and otherwise. And so if you're curious, I dare you to check it out. You can see it in theaters if it's near you. I saw it in theaters. I enjoyed seeing it in theaters, but I do and I'd love for people to support it, but I do genuinely feel like this is the perfect movie to watch Home Alone in the dark. I'm very excited to see what Kyle Edward Ball does next, and overall I've just been very fascinated by how this movie has blown up in the conversation that's happened around it. I think it's awesome, but let me know your thoughts on Skinamarink, guys. Have you seen it? Do you plan on checking it out? Again, it is dropping on Shudder on February 2nd. Don't forget to like and subscribe and keep an eye out for more videos soon. Thanks for watching.